I am on the way to pick up my brand new motorcycle. I am very, very excited. I think this is my unicorn. Enough said. So I'm very excited for the future in this bike. The bike's going really well.
Yeah, I can't believe how magic this bike is.
The other magic thing was the bike. It was absolutely superb. It met and exceeded my expectations. I realise it's quite enthusiastic of me to release a rainbow coloured thumbnail asking if this is the birth of a unicorn. And by the way, no, I haven't shrunk in the wash. I think this bike is fantastic. I've been holding back wanting to do all my riding, but right now I just want to tell everyone how impressed I am with this motorcycle. You need to keep account of the fact that I bought this motorcycle, I have skin in the game, I might still have some rose-colored glasses, but I am really loving this bike. You know, I've been on a journey looking for my unicorn. And someone asked me a question yesterday and I finally summed it up as best as I could. They asked me, is this the perfect dual sport? He's asking me, is this my unicorn? And I answered him saying, no, this isn't the perfect dual sport, but it is perfectly adaptable for my needs. And that's all I can ask for out of a motorcycle. And I'm really looking forward to the journey. But let's talk about the good, the bad, the ugly, and try and be as objective as possible, as not everyone is going to be as enthusiastic as me, or maybe you're wanting some proper objective information. So I'm going to do my best to bring myself back down to earth and go through this rationally with you and discuss whether this bike should be your next dual sport. So let's talk about the potential of this bike, and that's why I'm so excited for this machine. I've been looking for a bike that I can do commuting on in heavy traffic. I can put all my luggage on and do multi-day trips. I'm talking about trips where you're going out into the middle of nowhere, you're not going to see any life for days. You need to be able to carry all your water and fuel and your food and provide for yourself. So that's the kind of spectrum. And then in between we've got trails, day rides, single track, beach riding, deep sand, mud. Everything is basically what I need this bike to do. It's a big ask to find a motorcycle that can do that. And that's why I was so enthusiastic about the WR250R, because it could do all that. Now I think the 300 Honda has taken that crown. It does everything the WR does except for having better suspension, and I will give the WR that it does have a little lighter weight, although I cannot tell. The weight difference between these two bikes is so negligible that I can't notice, to be honest. I think this really is the do-all unicorn that we've been waiting for. Some people are going to complain that this isn't 300 or 350 cc's or 400 cc's, but I would say to you, this is just enough to be the perfect motorcycle. Once you get the suspension sorted on this bike, the world will be your oyster. If you were to line up a WR250R, a DRZ400, and this bike next to it, I'm going to take the 300L every day. So let's quickly talk about my riding experience. I owned a WR250R for many years. I've also owned a DRZ400E. Fortunately, I can't ride a KLX300 because they're not sold here in Australia. I have ridden the KLX250S. I've ridden my mate's CRF300L on road and off road. I've ridden the Rally. I've ridden an awful lot of bikes. All right, let's get into the bad rather than the good first. So I've talked about the soft suspension. Now for a brand new rider, this is going to be perfect for you. You don't need to worry about the suspension. It's fantastic for trail riding and easy to medium twin track. The suspension is just perfect for that kind of scenario. People like me complaining about the soft suspension, it's not something that's a game ender. For me, I think I can bump up the preload a bit and I could probably get 6 more months of riding without being too fussed about it. But what I have noticed is when I'm doing the single track and you're doing whoops and it's really starting to get complicated and asking a lot of the suspension, that's when the soft suspension really rears its head as a little bit of a frustration. So I had budgeted for my suspension, so I'm not surprised by it. But for someone that's not prepared for that, I can see that could be quite a shock, because suspension is probably the most expensive mod you can do on your motorcycle to improve it if you're going all out, which I may do. It's a hard ask for someone that's learning to ride, just bought their bike, and they're like, oh God, do I need to upgrade my suspension now? And then finding out how expensive it is. Don't freak out. You could probably get a year or two out of your bike before you need to worry about that if you're a learner. But if you're an intermediate rider and you're wanting a little more performance out of your suspension, just be aware that you'll probably find the limits of this pretty quickly. I also put brakes in here. It was debatable whether I would or not. The brakes aren't bad. but they're also not fantastic. Now, they're the same as a WR, they're the same as a DRZ, KLR, the CRF300L, but that's my point. It's 2021 and I really wanted improved braking. Now, yes, it's improved in that it has ABS, and I'm eternally thankful that they put that on this bike. But I really would have liked to have seen a noticeable increase in brake performance, and I really don't feel like that's there to any large degree. It might be a slightly bit better because this bike weighs a little less than the 250L, but I was really hoping for a wow factor kind of braking. So I'm putting that in the bad column, as I would have liked to have seen that in 2021. Next one on my list is the snatchy throttle. Now, this isn't really a criticism particularly of the Honda. My WR250R felt exactly the same with the EFI KLX I rode, same with every EFI single cylinder bike I've ridden, and even the twin and four cylinders. Snatchy throttles is just a result of emission standards and EFI. I've come to expect that, but if you're buying your first bike and you have that snatchy throttle, you might be prone to freaking out and thinking you've made the wrong choice. I can tell you, no matter what bike you choose in the category, if it's EFI, it's going to have that snatchy throttle. It's just part of playing the game of EFI modern single cylinders. So you can fix that with tuning the ECU, or you can go with the gearing so that you bring the gearing down so that when you're doing tight single track kind of work, you can sit in second gear where that snatchiness isn't there. The next criticism is one that I'm not sure whether this bike just doesn't have it or whether it's people who lack experience as well as the internet making this look far worse than it is. And I'm talking about the dreaded engine rattle that I keep getting questions about. And to be honest, I didn't even notice it to start with until I started getting questions. And there is a noticeable change in the smoothness of the bike. The bike goes from hyper smooth to just smooth or even a little bit rough from about 4,000 to 5,000 RPM and then back to smooth again. So that 1,000 RPM, between 4,000 and 5,000 RPM, the engine does rattle a little bit more or vibrate a little bit more than the rest of the rev range. Now, having ridden so many different single cylinder dual sport and enduro motorcycles, I can think of a handful of bikes that all do that. It's not a surprise to me. Most single cylinders have a spot in the rev range where they're not as smooth as others. Yes, be aware of it. Pay attention to it if you can get a test ride to see whether you can put up with it. Me, myself, it's so negligible that I didn't even notice to start with. I did want to point it out though and address that concern. The final complaint is getting your hands on one. Now, this isn't necessarily Honda's problem. This is every manufacturer's problem with supply chains and semiconductors being so hard to get their hands on. It is very difficult for a manufacturer to get their product to the person. So we've got people on long wait lists for these bikes. One, it speaks to the popularity of them. They barely hit the showroom floor before they're off to their owners. You can't get a test ride on one of these here in Australia, but that is going to be a detriment as well if it's anything like that in the rest of the world. If you can't get your product to the customer, they're going to look elsewhere. That is something that Honda really need to pay attention to in order for this bike to be as popular as possible. I think they need to be delivering their product as quickly as possible to the customer and looking at ways to mitigate the issues they're currently experiencing. So it's the next day and typically I have forgotten a few really important items. The first one I wanted to address is the subframe. Now, the subframe on this 300L is actually welded to the frame, whereas like the WR250R, that is a bolted on subframe. So if it cracks or breaks, you can remove it. On this one, you cannot. So that is something you'll have to think about. For me personally, I'm not worried in the slightest. I pack very light and I really think about what I'm putting onto the bike, particularly on the top rack, so that I don't overstress my subframe. But if you're the kind of guy who likes to pack the kitchen sink, his coffee machine and his wife all on the back, then you're probably asking a little too much of these little bikes. Like I said, I'm not really worried. I know I'm a very light packer, so I don't think I'll be asking much of this little bike. The other issue that I heard spoken about quite a bit is the heat issue coming off the engine. Now, I will say that you do notice it. It is a marked increase over the CRF300L, so you will notice heat coming off this bike. I think it's particularly from the little fan in here on the radiator, and it might also be down here from the exhaust, because the extractors for the exhaust are very small, so the pipe is very small diameter, so there's a lot of heat there. So I'm not sure if that can be addressed with a pipe swap and swapping out the whole system. That way you've got more airflow and it will be cooler, so I think that may mitigate it a bit, as well as an ECU tune. But to be honest, it really isn't a problem unless I'm riding on the road where I've only got Kevlar jeans on. That's when I notice the heat coming onto the top of my knee and onto my shin. Now, it's never enough for it to reach unbearable or uncomfortable levels. It just means when it's hotter weather, it does get a little bit irritating. I will say also, when I'm off-road riding, I do not notice it at all. That is because I've got thick riding pants on. I've also got big knee guards with shin plates and my MX boots on top of that. So absolutely no engine heat comes through that I can feel, and that's the most important scenario. So it's only a problem in warmer weather with thin riding jeans on. Now let's talk about the good, and there's an awful lot to talk about here. Like I said in the intro, I think this is going to be my unicorn, so there's a lot to discuss here. Let's start with the looks. The look of the bike, well, I think it looks absolutely fantastic, especially with the LED setup. I do recognize that not everyone is lucky enough to get that setup, but here in Australia, we get the LED setup, so it looks very aggressive like the 450L, which I think personally looks fantastic. So I'm very happy to get the brighter, more modern headlight. And the fact that the LEDs stay on as running lights during the day gives me a little more confidence in drivers seeing where I am. And having been someone that's been hit by a car on a motorcycle, I certainly appreciate visibility. The next plus is power. This bike, I was a little skeptical whether it would suit my needs, only being 286 cc's, and that might seem strange considering I'm coming from a WR250R, but the WR250R at peak horsepower, I believe, makes a little more than this. But at the same time, this motor is torquier and it makes almost as much horsepower at a lower RPM than the WR. It really does in the seat feel far more powerful than the WR. Now, it's not as big a difference as going from a 250R to say a DRZ 400, but it certainly is noticeable enough. It really shows itself in two distinct ways. That is really low speed kind of stuff in single track if you're in second gear to try and keep that throttle smooth and you're lugging the bike. This has more torque and it's not as hard to stall. So that's a real important factor for me. It's easy to ride because of that extra torque. The other thing is its noticeable improvement over the 250R at high speeds. This has far more legs at higher speeds than the 250R did. Now the 250R is surprisingly good on the highway for a 250, but this is even better, which is just perfect for me because I always wanted that little bit more out of the 250R. So if that's you, that's what the L gives you. Highway performance. This one is probably one of the most shocking things. I talked about this with Noob Routes, who's over in the East. He also has a YouTube channel and he's got a 300 Rally. And we were both just gobsmacked at how well this does on the highway. It has no reason to be as good as it is and as collected as it feels on the open highway. Now, I need to caveat that with, don't expect this to be adventure bike levels of good on the open road. It's a single cylinder, very light dual sport, so it's still going to feel buffeted around on the wind and it's still going to be quite revvy. But if you're comparing it to the competition, the KLX 250, CRF 250L, WR 250R, and even the DRZ because of its 5-speed and poor gearing, this bike just sits on the highway so comfortably, which is something I can't say for the rest of the bikes. The WR just did it, but once you put luggage on it, it really wasn't an enjoyable experience. This, it's got the torque to handle that and it really is quite comfortable, and it just has a little more legs for overtaking big trucks out on the open road, which is an important thing here in Australia because we have huge road trains out in the middle of nowhere and they're going at very high speeds. So you need a bike that can overtake a truck doing 100 to 110 with ease. So I can say that this bike can do that without breaking a sweat. So it's very, very confidence inspiring out on the open road. The next one is ABS. This one could have gone either way depending on how they implemented this ABS system, but I'm happy to say they've done as good a job as I've seen any manufacturer do. It's safe on the road and I'm eternally grateful to have ABS, as I think it's a necessity on the road. You don't need it until it's an emergency situation and then it's a life-saving piece of technology. Off-road, I hate ABS. In fact, I usually try and avoid a bike with ABS off-road if I can help it. And I'm happy to say that Honda have made this so easy to turn off that it hasn't been a bigger issue as I thought it is. In fact, it's not been a problem at all. You just hold down the button for a couple of seconds seconds, and the rear ABS is completely off. There's no going through 1,000 different menus, doing a fertility dance and then praying to the rain gods for your ABS to switch off. It's just very simple and job done, and you can get on the ride as quickly as possible. And I really want as little friction as possible on my off-road rides, considering I've got all the camera equipment and the communications to think about whilst I'm out there riding, and also trying not to fall off. The less I have to think about, the better. Fuel consumption was one that surprised me quite a bit. I was expecting this to use more fuel than the 250L did. I'm getting anywhere from 29 to 31.5 kilometers per litre. My WR, I was getting 23 to about 26. The fact that this bike is more fuel efficient, I guess I shouldn't be surprised because of the technology and the experience they now have with the emission standards and getting bikes as fuel efficient as possible. The fact that it's a bigger motor but still more fuel efficient than the outgoing model is impressive. It might also have something to do with the torque of this bike, the fact that you don't have to rev it as much to get it to do what you need. As the 250L, you need to thrash it a bit more to get it to do what this bike will do. So fuel consumption was a pleasant surprise. The next one is price, which is obviously going to vary depending on country to country, but the fact that you can get a bike with this much potential for $8,000 Australian right away just blows my mind. It really is very well priced. Yes, it's more expensive than the 250L was, but you've got to expect that with inflation, improvements in technology, not to mention the whole world being turned on its head with this massive health crisis. Things are not the same as they used to be. So the fact that it's still as cheap as it is really is impressive, and a big reason why it was so appealing to me. Rather than spending $17,000 on a 500 EXC, getting one of these for less than half the price is just absolutely gobsmacking. So I think it's a great choice if you're looking for a budget dual sport. The final really impressive thing about this bike, and is in the good column, is the light clutch and that slipper clutch. The fact that it's such a light clutch pull has just been a godsend, particularly for me. Now, I've got a big ass metal plate in my left wrist holding all my bones together. I also have occupational overuse syndrome, or RSI, in both my arms. So I constantly see an OT to manage that. So a light clutch is very important for my comfort on the bike. And the fact that this is so light really helps me go longer, further without having pain, and that improves my riding experience exponentially. I also think it's a massive advantage for learner riders. Now, for learner riders that don't have that muscles and haven't trained their arm to be used to pulling in a clutch a lot, particularly in tight technical riding or in commuting when you're stuck in traffic, I think this is really going to make the experience easier, makes the bike a little less intimidating and easier to handle. So one major thing I forgot to put in my positives yesterday is just how easy it is to ride this bike. Hopping on this bike within an hour or two, I felt like I'd owned it for years. I was comfortable, felt natural. I didn't have to think about anything I was doing more so than a bike I had owned for many years, like the WR250R. And I think that is a real testament to just how well Honda have designed this motorcycle. It's user-friendly, it's confidence-inspiring, and it's an absolute blast. I think they've really made that balance of it still being great for the learner, but still offering plenty for the intermediate riders. Consider I've ridden all the bikes I'm talking about here, and I've owned most of the ones I'm talking about. I really do think if you're looking for a bike to do single track, multi-day trips, commute to work, and do fire trails and dirt riding, just a little bit of everything, but you want it to be lightweight, durable, you don't want to have to service it all the time, so you need long service intervals, and you want a bike that can have a lot of accessories and carry your luggage. This is the unicorn I've been looking for. I'm so pleased that I took the leap of faith, put a deposit on one, and just bought it without test riding it. It was a big leap of faith. It's not something I would recommend doing if you can avoid it. It's the first time I've done that, but I certainly am happy of how this has turned out, and I'm really looking forward to my journey with this bike. Thanks for watching. Hopefully this has given you some food for thought on what you're going to do for your next motorcycle. I definitely would suggest putting this on a list. Thanks for sticking with me. Don't forget to stay shiny side up, and expect plenty of awesome off-road rides from me in the future on this wee little beastie. So catch you later, guys.